Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. Welcome to this month's Connect with Control-M. Today we'll be talking about the installation and deployment of Control-M9 in the cloud, and more specifically, AWS, or Amazon Web Services. My name is Ted Levitt, and I'm a lead technical support analyst at BMC Software, located in the US, and I support the Control-M products for distributed systems. I've been working for BMC now for about 19 years. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce today's panelists, Fei Wang, Erwin Sanchez, and Melvin Abraham. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please do enter them in the Q&A panel, and we'll cover them at the end of the session. If you wish to save today's presentation, you can do so by going to File and then Save, and then saving it as a PDF. Now let's look at today's agenda. So first, I'm going to show you the Control-M installation media for the cloud. It's going to be slightly different than the regular installation media. Be talking about the compatibility of the Control-M cloud installation, addressing specifically RDS. We'll look at security groups, which is essentially the firewall, and talk about the Control-M ports that are involved with the product. We'll touch on agents and agentless deployment in the cloud. We'll briefly talk about the Control-M on the Amazon Marketplace. I'll demonstrate the deployment of an EC2 instance and an RDS instance, as well as the installation of Enterprise Manager on an EC2 instance using Postgres RDS. There are a couple of tips we have, and then we'll answer your questions live. So before we get too much further, I'd like to touch on some terminology. I'll be using some acronyms on a regular basis here. Want to just cover them before we go there. The AWS is Amazon Web Services. It's essentially the combination of cloud services offered by Amazon, including the compute, database, networking, and storage solutions. The EC2 is the Elastic Compute Cloud. It's essentially the compute portion of the AWS where you're running your OS images. The RDS is the relational database services. It's going to be the provision databases. Currently, I think there are 6 different vendors, and we're supporting 3 of those. Elastic IP, or EIP, is a service which allows you to associate a static public IP to an EC2 instance so that you don't have to worry about the public address changing. The VPC is a virtual private cloud. It's essentially a service that allows you to more robustly connect an individual EC2 instance to your your corporate network. You can think of it as sort of a cloud VPN. And the public DNS is essentially the name of the IP associated with the instance. And typically in AWS and other cloud services, it's a long name. And again, if you don't have a VPC or EIP associated with an image, that public IP is going to be changing with each start. So, about the media, again, this is a separate piece of installation media from our default installation. It has a couple of tweaks, namely to support the RDS installation and for the Corba endpoints, which is essentially how the EM components register themselves on the network and such. The 9.018 version that's coming out in the near future is not going to need or have a specific cloud install, but we have this for version 9 right now. At the bottom of my screen, you can see the title of the media, as you'll see it on EPD, and I'll walk you through screens in just a minute. You'll see Control-M version 9.0.00 with cloud support V2. So this is a new media, V2, and then for the platform, in this case, Microsoft Windows. Now, when you're going to download the media, I'd like to point you to a YouTube video which describes the process rather well. You can use this to log in. Assuming you've already logged in, I'd like to show the screens in the EPD. Here, I have the component view, which is the default view for the EPD once you've logged in. In order to find the cloud installation media, you have to search on either the product Control M Enterprise Manager or Control M Server. Here in the circle on the left side with the number 1 next to it, I've put in Control M Enterprise Manager. That results in finding number 2, the circle on the right, Control M Enterprise Manager. When we click that item, we're then presented with the product view. Now, by default, this will open us up in the documentation tab. So we first have to click number 1 to bring us to the products, which will be the installation media. I want to see a specific installation media, in this case Linux. I've selected that at the platform, or number 2. I click number 3 to go to apply the filter, and then we see the installation media in number 4. You'll have the tarball or zip file if it's Windows, and the ISO file, the DVD image. So this is showing you the Unix media, Control M version 9 with cloud support v2 for Novell, SUSE Linux, and Red Hat. That brings me to our next point of compatibility. So this installation is RDS focused, but we do currently support Red Hat and SUSE Linux for the Control M Enterprise Manager and Control M Server, and Microsoft Windows, all of those EC2 images. Right now, we don't currently support Amazon Linux for the EM or M server, but we do support it on the Control M agent, FixPack 200 and above. For the RDS, we support Postgres, Oracle, and MS SQL. There are a couple of things of note. When you're building a Postgres RDS, we need to make sure the version is at least 9.5.5 or higher. I think currently it's defaulting to 9.6.2, so that's good. The other thing of note is that when you're building a Postgres RDS, the master ID, when you're building it, needs to be master. And I'll cover both of these points in the demo. With the Oracle and MS SQL, the DBA ID or SA account can be anything, because that'll be part of the installation prompting. It'll ask you for what is the DBA ID. And in terms of SQL, we need to make sure that MS SQL is in mixed mode authentication, because we're relying on our local SQL authentication for the installation. Now, the other thing of note is that with Control M high availability, we currently, with the cloud installation media, support Oracle and MS SQL. We don't currently support Control M HA with Postgres with this installation. Now, we'll talk a little bit about security groups. This is essentially something in the Amazon Web Services console that lets you set up access on the network. And with each image, you're going to have a security group. Now, we need to open the ports for the product to ensure that you can connect to it from wherever you need to connect to it. And I'll go over the port ranges I have defined here. So port 7005 is the Control M agent to server port by default. 7006 is the server to agent port. So you may or may not need to have these open depending on where your agents are and so forth. Port 22 in this case is the SSH port, so this is open for management purposes. Port 8443 is the Control M Automation API, or the secure web server for the Enterprise Manager. The 18080 is the Control M EM web server, the unsecured port. And then the port 13075 is the Control M Enterprise Manager Corba naming service port. And then by default with the cloud install, we're allocating a range of 22 ports, by default 13076 to 13098 for the endpoints, which are going to be your EM components, like your GUI server, your self-service server, etc. Now, you'll see here that I have a source address of 0000/0. Typically a very bad idea. This is essentially opening up connections from the world. You'll want to restrict this to specific address ranges or subnets. If you're using a VPC and an alternate DNS solution, you'll be using that there. One thing of note as well if when you're performing the installation of the Control-M, if you don't have it configured for a VPC, we would strongly suggest associating an elastic IP or EIP to the EC2 instance before installing Control-M. That'll give it a static public IP, because if you don't have an EIP or you're not associated with a defined VPC, the public IP address of the EC2 instance will change with each restart of that instance, and that'll cause problems with the enterprise manager because it'll be configured for the public IP at the time of installation. So you'll have to essentially reconfigure the enterprise manager for the new public IP with each restart, and we want to avoid doing that. Now, with the RDS, it's similar, but a little more simple here. So by default, the RDS instances use the same port as the normal product in Oracle, the listener 1521, with Postgres 5432, and MS SQL 1433. So the note here also is that you can change the Oracle listener or the Postgres listening port and perform the installation with that custom port, but we still require that the default port be used for an MS SQL installation. You can change the port subsequent to the installation, but you need to use the 1433 to start. In terms of the security group, you need to make sure that the internal IP of your Control-M installation has access to the listening port of the database. In the case where you're using the reporting facility, you need to make sure that the clients have access to the database port as well, because the reporting facility in version 9 is connecting to the database still. In version 9.018, the reporting facility or reporting tool won't be doing that direct connect to the database server. So just something to keep in mind in terms of opening the ports up. Now, in terms of the agent and agentless, we can use the regular installation media. As I said earlier, the Amazon Linux install requires a minimum of 9 FixPack 2. We would typically recommend keeping up to date on the FixPacks with any new installation, but otherwise the agent is going to be essentially the same as a normal host, with the exception or with the consideration that you have the networking between the two hosts, the agent and the server, sorted out. There is some information that we'll discuss later about that. Another thing to be mindful of is that with the Control-M, we have a limit of 50 characters for the host name, including the name and the domain. So some of these names in cloud computing can get quite long and may exceed the 50 character limit, in which case we'll need an alternative for that, either another DNS solution, an alias in a local host file, a CNAME, something along these lines. There is an enhancement open currently for this, but it is not yet implemented. Now, I'd like to take you over to the AWS console, and I'm going to look at provisioning an EC2 instance. All right, so here I've logged into our AWS console. This is the standard generic console. Yours may look slightly different, but I clicked launch instance in the console. Now I'm presented with a list of different OS images that I can select. I have at the top Amazon Linux, which I don't want to use for EM or Control-M server, Red Hat, SUSE Linux, I'm going to skip Ubuntu there, and Microsoft Windows. So we want to select either Red Hat, SUSE, or Windows. I'm going to select Red Hat install for us here. The second thing that it brings us to is the instance type. Now, you have a variety of different options to select, including the CPU and memory. The thing we need to do here is consider the size of your implementation. You want to size the EC2 image appropriate to the number of jobs and executions and users you're going to have. So to meet the minimum requirements here, I'm just going to specify a T2 large with 8 gigs of memory. We can see if I'm scrolling down, it gets pretty big. I'm going to click Next and go to Instance Details. This essentially talks about the networking. This is going to be specific to your installation. I'm not going to really get into this. And then in terms of storage, this is the disk that's being used by your image. You're going to, again, want to make sure that you have sufficient space for the installation as well as your logs and any maintenance you may be applying. For a base install here that I may just be doing to test, I'm going to put 40 gigabytes. That's going to allow me to extract the installation media, perform the install, and apply a fix pack without too much difficulty. We have the tags. I'm not going to talk about that. Again, specific to your installation. But we move to security groups. This is what I had shown earlier in the screenshot. We have the opportunity to select either an existing security group if you have something predefined, or create a new security group. Now, by default, all that it's essentially going to have open is the management, but we will have to add rules for the different components as we did earlier. For example, I'm going to add a port here for the Control-M web server, port 18080. I'm going to put the destination, or sorry, the source address is 0000, and then we can put a comment here for EM web server. So you'll have to do this with consideration for the Control-M products you're going to be installing, and if you're going to be selecting any non-default ports with the installation. Our next button is going to be Review and Launch, and you're presented with a summary of the different items here. And then at this point, I would click Launch. Since I already have an EC2 instance, I'm not going to launch this one, but I'm going to go over and provision an RDS. So I go to the RDS console under Services in the AWS console, and then I can scroll down a little bit and launch a DB instance. Now here I'm presented with a selection of different vendors to choose from. We have Aurora, MySQL, and MariaDB. These are not databases which we currently support. We have Postgres, Oracle, and SQL Server. These are databases that we do support, and I'm going to select a Postgres server, and then click Next. I'm presented with the second choice of my use. I'm going to select Dev Test, and then click Next. And now I want to address the specific points that I had mentioned earlier. We have the version. Again, we need 955 or above. We're defaulting to 962, which is fine. So we're going to keep this at 962. We have our DB instance class, and this is going to be the CPU and memory. Again, it's important to consider your load, the number of jobs, executions, users, what products you have installed, etc. here. So you want to select something appropriate. I'm just going to select something pretty inky-dinky for the purposes of installation. We then have the selection of storage. Again, we come to sizing here. We want to make sure that we have enough disk in the RDS instance to be able to serve the application. So this again depends on the number of jobs, log retention, audit, etc., etc. So we're just going to put 40 in there. Again, this is all depending on your environment. The instance identifier, this is going to be, this can really be anything. This will be something you want to make sense to you for the purposes of finding your instance in the console, essentially. And then our master username. This is the last piece of important information we need. we need to make sure that this master username is Postgres, because this is what's assumed by the installation. And then we can set the password and then hit next to get to the next screen. And here we're presented with some advanced options, which include the networking information. This is going to be specific to your implementation, whether or not you're using a VPC, etc. We have a database name. We don't need to put one in here if you don't want to create a database specifically. The Control-M installation will create databases, so you need not worry about that. Our port number that we're going to be using, by default, 5432 is the Postgres listening port. Whether or not we want to do encryption or backup, entirely to you to determine that. Your maintenance window, and so forth. We have another option here, enable auto miner version upgrade. This is okay as long as we're using a supported version of the Postgres server. So I would at this point click launch DB instance, but since I already have an RDS instance, don't need to start a second one at this point. So I'm going to go over to a terminal window here and connect to an EC2 instance that I already have set up, and I'm going to log in as a clean user and start the installation of the Enterprise Manager and walk through that. I have the media extracted to the /media directory, and I'm going to run the installation from here. It'll look like a pretty normal installation to start. Both is the case for Linux and Windows. I'm answering yes to do the non-graphical installation, skipping the license agreement, because you've already read it, right? And then I'm going to only be installing the Enterprise Manager. So I'm going to select item number 3 for the first installation, and then answer 2 to only install Enterprise Manager. We would generally recommend that specifically for production installs that you install the Control-M server and Enterprise Manager in separate accounts for the sake of maintenance and so forth. So I'm going to answer N to go to the next screen. And then, since I'm going to be installing with an RDS and want to be able to specify parameters, I'm going to answer number 2 for a custom installation, and then go to the next screen. Since it's a Linux installation, I have the opportunity to use Postgres or Oracle. If it was a Windows installation, it would be Postgres or MS SQL. I'm going to be doing a Postgres install here, and then I have a few different options. So I have the option to install a dedicated Postgres server that comes with the Enterprise Manager in this case. I have the opportunity to use an existing Postgres server from another Control-M product. We don't really see that done too often. Or we have the opportunity to use an RDS. So I'm going to change this and select item number 3 so I can use an RDS. Now you wouldn't see this installation option for the Oracle install, because on this screen where I'm prompted for the host interface and DB port number, this is a similar screen I'm going to get for Oracle, but on this screen in Oracle, an additional question will be presented to me asking whether or not this is a regular Oracle install or an RDS. So if I was installing to an Oracle RDS here, I'd answer that question with a yes. Now, what is my host interface name for my RDS? What is my port number? So we walked through that earlier with the provisioning or the launching of that instance, but if you have something else that's already running, how do we determine that? So I'm going to go over to my RDS instance or my RDS console. I'm going to select instances on the left, and then I currently have one DB instance, Postgres. I'm going to open the details of that up, and this is going to give me some charts based on usage and stuff, but below this, if I scroll down, I'm going to have some configuration details about the database, and this is the information that I'm going to use. I see here to connect to the database, I have an endpoint, and I want to specifically select that endpoint. So that's what I'm going to use for the host name, and we see the port 5432. So I'm going to put in option number 1. I'm going to paste that endpoint that I copied from the console. And for question number 2, I'm going to answer with our port number 5432. Now at this point, when I click next, if I'm unable to connect to the database, I would have been told at that point. And if your instance is running and you have all the right information and you're not able to connect, one of the first places I would look would be the security group for the RDS instance. Now, we have our choice of database owner and password. Uh-oh. Okay, I just lost connection there for a second, but it's back. So I already have an enterprise manager installed in there, so I'm going to have to select a unique username. So I did that. And then I'm going to put in the password for the database owner. And then again, for the database admin, we assume Postgres for the user. We aren't able to select the user, so I put that in. And now at this point, when I click next, we'll get the next panel. If I had selected a database owner username that already existed or put in a bad Postgres password, we'd be stopped at this point. Now, the last prompt we have here is to select the database name. I already have EM900 built. I'm going to put in EM demo. And then whether or not I want to create a CJK or Asian language support database. By default, it's no. I'm going to leave it with that value. Now I'm going to select next. Our prompt here is for our ports for the Corba naming service and web server. These are our default values. Like I'd mentioned in the security group, we're 13075 for the naming service, and then we're going to assume that our endpoints start at 13076 with a range of 22 ports if that item is selected. If you change item number 1, it'll start the port range from the next port and then 22 from there. Right? I'm going to leave these default and then select next, and then I'm presented with the installation summary screen where most of my selections have been presented on the screen for me. I can do G to save it to a file for use or to keep in my records, and I would hit I to do the installation at this point. To save us some time, since the installation can take 5-10 minutes depending on the speed of the machine, I'm going to break out here and I'm going to exit and log in as another user where I already have the Enterprise Manager installed. Okay, so I'm in as this user, and since my Control-M Enterprise Manager isn't running, I'm going to start it up by running the start config agent script. Now, you'll notice that the host name of my EC2 image in this case is 172.31.745, which is the internal IP, and this is how the image is going to be built if you're not in a VPC and haven't done anything in particular special. But I have my EIP associated with it, and that EIP is going to be the external public IP that I'm going to use to connect to the Enterprise Manager. Now, I'm going to check to see how we're doing in terms of starting the processes. We can see here that my configuration agent has started my naming service, the REST serve, and web server, but it still hasn't started other stuff. I'm going to give it just a minute to start the other components, and we see here now that we've started my global condition server, GUI server, gateway, etc. So I have a number of components that would have registered in the naming service, and I can display those by running the command orb admin nslist. And I'm doing this for the purposes of showing you that I have, with the installation, when my EIP was running, it is configured to use the elastic IP of the EC2 instance that I had related to it before I performed the installation. And then in turn, we can see that the different endpoints for the components, the GUI server and the configuration server, are using that port range, 13076, 077, 078, 79, 80, and walking up. So this is how we would expect an EC2 instance with Control M related to an EIP look. Now, I have the security group for this instance set up to allow me to connect to it from the BMC network. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize our previous two windows, and then I'm going to launch both the Workload Automation GUI and the Control M Configuration Manager. And we'll have these come up in just a second. And we'll see here that we're going to be pointing to the EIP, which was that 125 address in this case. But we'll take a look here. So we see that in the host name, I've specified our EIP address, but by default, again, we're using the host name, which is that internal address for the name of the components. So I'm going to log in here to the Configuration Manager, and the configuration, or the Workload Automation GUI here, again, we're connecting to the EIP, but because this is an EC2 instance without any customization and not on a VPC, we're using, excuse the Configuration Manager here popping up and stealing the thunder. Minimize that. And we see the GUI server name is, again, that internal address. You can resolve this if you want to by simply, in the Configuration Manager, deleting and redefining components with specific names. That will take care of any name change you want to do. If you want to call it prod GUI server or what have you, you can do that fairly easily. And if and when my Configuration Manager comes up here, we can see that it's connected to my Enterprise Manager. I have a gateway up showing disconnected because I haven't started my Control M server. But if I were to start my Control M server, I would connect to that and be able to submit jobs and so forth. The one last point that I want to point out is that the installation with the Cloud Media, and I had this in the slide, but I didn't specifically reference it, is the Cloud Media bundles FixPaks. So we bundle FixPak 400 and Patch 407 with the Enterprise Manager, and FixPak 300 with the Control M server. But again, back to what we recommend for best practices, I have applied FixPak 500 to the Enterprise Manager here, just like I would any other installation of Control M, and the same would hold true with the Control M server. You could put FixPak 400 right on top of that and hit Patch 401 if you wanted to. So that'll conclude my demo. I'm going to pop back to the slides here and cover a couple of different items we have on the tip slide. The first item is a white paper and FAQ on the AWS or cloud install. It's going to be in Article 132990. And the second item is, with each product we release, we have release notes, and there may be certain non-intuitive things or something that maybe you need to specifically reference that isn't apparent in the installer script or something. Please do take a gander at the release notes before proceeding with the installation. Now, I hope what I've shown you today was useful. After you close the webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we would encourage you to fill that out and give us some feedback on where we can improve and any future topics that you'd like to see. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and our past webinars can be viewed on Communities or on YouTube and iTunes. And today's webinar and Q&A will be posted there in a couple of days. Our next webinar topic will be Control M Automation API Advanced Topics.